Okay, so you'll see that the title looks a little bit familiar because yesterday we were talking about research methods as well. So I actually have adjusted my presentation a little bit because Danielle and Franz covered so well and so completely some of the fundamentals of research methods. So I was able to take out some of the slides I had thought about and added in some different ones. So my plan now, the slightly revised plan, is first of all to talk about not how, but first of all what we might be researching in the future. What are some of the technology-related topics that are kind of emerging or have not yet been well researched? And so if anyone's looking for project ideas for the next phase, whether that means a postdoc or early career project to get you going in your new position, these might give you some ideas. Then I will turn to methods and talk about some examples. Basically, I've selected some examples of different ways that we can research technology. And my goal there is really to sort of just promote the diversity of options, right? That there are actually many different ways that you can investigate technology. So my hope is that you'll walk away from today with some ideas about what might be interesting topics to research, where there's a need for research, but also maybe just to think about some approaches to investigating technology that you might not have considered before. And then in the last part, I'm going to talk about one particular approach that I think is a sort of one that's, it's not new, but it's one that's garnering more attention because now more and more people are using technology. So I wanted to talk a little bit about community-based participatory research, how we can do research with users. So we'll sort of spend a little bit more time looking at that one particular method, which I think is becoming more popular, but also has some particular characteristics about it that I think we need to be aware of. So that's my sort of plan for the next hour and a half. So we'll start off by looking at which topics can or maybe need to be researched or already have maybe not received as much attention as we would like, that are becoming a little urgent. And I've kind of tried to frame this around sort of looking at benefits of new technologies like neural machine translation and large language models, so AI-based technology. What are some of the benefits, but also what are some of the costs? And in particular, I think the costs need a lot of attention. We're not quite sure yet how these are impacting our profession, our society, and so on. So if we look at this as a sort of iceberg, some of the things that we've already explored are kind of above the water, and then lurking there in the deep below the waterline are areas where maybe we do need to pay a little bit more attention. So some of the things that we know, let's start above the waterline, some of the things that we know already about AI-based technologies for translation is that they are adaptable. They do learn in their own way. It's not the same way that we learn things, but they do learn in the sense that if we give them more data, if we give them better data, they can improve. So we know that they are adaptable technologies, but we don't necessarily know how to fine-tune them ideally yet. So we still need, that's one area where there's a need for more research on how exactly should we be curating this data to get the best output from these tools? So data curation is one side to improve the quality of the learning and the output. We also know that these tools are at least promoted, if not actually used to improve productivity, right? The main line that we hear about tools is that they will help us work more quickly, or they will help us improve the volume of work that we can do in a certain period of time. So again, we need to quantify that a little bit more. I think, under what conditions are we genuinely getting benefit from this? Because as we talked about the other day, we know there are huge environmental costs, there's a lot of anxiety, so there's like emotional costs to these tools, and we want to try and make sure that if we're using them, we're actually getting a benefit from them. And if we're not getting a benefit from them, then maybe we want to curb our use or be more selective about when and how we use them. So I think we need to really quantify some of this. What is the productivity boost that we get or not? And under what conditions? How can we tweak that and say, with this certain set of conditions, it makes sense to use these tools. With this other set of conditions, it makes less sense. So we need to figure out what are those conditions. We also, I think, maybe need to consider different ways of benefiting from technology beyond this, productivity boost, like the hard numbers. How many more words can I translate, or how much faster can I translate? We have to look at other ways of using the tools. So even something like inspiration, which is much harder to quantify, much harder to kind of put, figures on, but I think a potentially more valuable use in some cases for these technologies is not to replace us, but to augment our own capacities. So but it's very challenging to come up with methods for how do you quantify being inspired? How do you measure inspiration? So someone who wants a challenge, I think there's work to be done there. I think we also now have so many tools at our disposal. How are we putting these tools together in a sensible way? Is there a kind of chaining of the tools that we can envisage? Can the output of one tool feed into the input of another tool in a sensible way? We often start off by looking at technologies as independent pieces, but we have quite a few now that could be put together, assembled in various ways. And again, we need to think about, what's the most sensible way of doing that? So an example might be, that it's becoming more and more common for researchers to produce a plain language summary of their work, for example. And it's also becoming encouraged for us to make our work available in other languages, especially these types of plain language summaries, because they might be for the local community rather than for other researchers. So if we think about AI tools, they can both help with simplification of text, summarization of text, and translation of text. We know they can do all of those things, maybe not perfectly, but they can help us with those three tasks. But if we wanted to get a plain language summary in another language, what makes more sense? Should we simplify the text and then summarize it and then translate it? Or should we translate the whole text and then produce a summary of the translated text? What order makes the most sense and gives the best results? So how can we combine these different tools and techniques, and in what order? I think we have work to do there in terms of improving the workflow and the chaining of these different tools. And then we also, I think, have realized that because these tools are out there now, available on the desktop of anyone who has or not even the desktop, even on their phone, anyone who has an internet connection can access machine translation and query large language models. So how are people using them? We know a lot about our own community. We know a lot about how translators, interpreters, terminologists use technology, but we are not as well informed yet about the much wider public. And it's starting. I've chatting with students who are looking at how is machine translation being used in healthcare, how is it being used in legal settings, but we need to know a lot more about it. So we have definitely work to do to uncover these new markets, in a sense, for translation technologies, or to understand the extent to which they can help to meet needs that are currently being unmet by our own professional services, for example. So lots of things there where I definitely see the potential for technology to be beneficial. And then under the water are some of the areas that are either just almost completely unknown, or the little bit that we know about them is perhaps disturbing or unwelcome. And so we need to come up with solutions maybe to combat some of those concerns that we have, to kind of figure out how to turn a concerning situation into one that is less concerning or even beneficial. And some of these we talked about already in the discussion on ethics, for example, but there are lots of unknowns or under-researched areas at the moment. So if we start looking now below the waterline, one of the things that I already mentioned is that these tools are a little bit opaque. We don't know exactly what's happening in them. And what that means for us is that they're a little bit unpredictable. If we knew how these tools were arriving at the decisions that they made, then we could almost, predict a little bit what the results would be. But because we don't know exactly how they're making their decisions, it means that the technology is a little bit unpredictable or inconsistent. And that makes it risky to use, right? If we could be confident that we'd always get comparable results, then we could, make better decisions about when to use it and when not. But because it's unpredictable, we have to start trying ourselves to see if there are patterns. Maybe it looks unpredictable now, but if we dig a little deeper, there are some ways of predicting more what the output will be. And so we need to understand what are those potential triggers for getting results in one direction or another. We know that a problem, but just a reality of these tools is that they don't understand text. They process text, but they don't understand it. They don't think the way people do. They don't have any capacity for semantics. They are pattern matching tools at their base. And so what limits does that pose for communication? Right? For us, communication is almost founded on making ourselves understood to other people. And if these tools don't understand in the way that we do, what are the limits of this approach to processing language? A little bit worse than not understanding, we also find sometimes that these tools actually make things up, right? That this is called a hallucination, is the term that the technologists use to describe information that is wrong, artificial, made up. So in the case of translation, it's sort of like adding something to the target text that is not based on anything found in the source text or not motivated for any other good reason that we can see. Mm-hmm. So can we see any patterns about what is prompting these hallucinations, or are they completely random? So we need to understand a little bit more about what's behind them. We also, I think, have potential to explore some reception studies of machine translated output or the output of large language models. One of the things we know about them is that they often sound good. Right? They sound very plausible, they're smooth, they're much more fluent than the older rule-based machine translation systems. One of the, now in hindsight, at the time we thought it was terrible, but now in hindsight, one of the helpful things about rule-based machine translation was that it sounded very clunky, it sounded very awkward. We could immediately recognize when we were dealing with machine translation output, and that is less the case now. Now the text often sounds, at first reading, relatively smooth, potentially plausible, but it could be completely inaccurate. It could be saying something completely different than the source text. And how are users of these machine translated texts, how are they coping with that? Do they sort of operate on a sort of autopilot, like, oh, if it sounds good, it must be right? These are people who don't necessarily understand the source language. They can't verify the way we can, whether something has been accurately translated. And so how does this affect their behavior, their trust in machine translated output? Something that is, I think, maybe not well sold by our own community, us as translators, one of the things that we could use perhaps as a selling point for our own skills is that we as professionals can sometimes compensate for faulty input. Nobody likes to get a really crummy source text, but we've all had them, right? We've all had well-written source texts, and we've all had pretty crummy source texts to deal with. And one of the things that we are able to do is come up with a decent target text based off of a kind of, crummy source text. Technology at the moment can't do that. So again, I'm not advocating that we want to get crummy source texts, but we do have skills. We're often asking ourselves, what do we bring to the table that these tools don't? And one of the things is that we can compensate for faulty input. Now, sometimes that faulty input is just really simple, like a comma is out of place, or there's a missing accent on something, or it's incorrectly capitalized. But even those very small things are not well handled by technology. It takes what you give it and it processes what you give it because it doesn't understand. So if there's an accent missing on a source text, it will potentially come up with the wrong translation, or even if there's a punctuation error. So I think one of the things, if we're looking for ways that we can outperform technology, it could be in this capacity that we have to kind of compensate for faulty input. So again, something just to explore. I don't have a particular project in design in mind, but I think that it's something that might be worth investigating. We also maybe want to probe a little bit about how we should or can structure information in order to get the most beneficial results for machine translation. We might see that if we really want to optimize these tools, we need to provide input in a slightly different format or way. We know that these tools can process only limited amounts of information at once. Sometimes they have trouble even crossing a sentence boundary. So, understanding what a pronoun is referring back to. This can be like a stumbling block for machine translation. So we know that they can only process a limited amount of information at a time, but we have to explore how limited, what boundaries are there, and if we choose to use machine translation, do we need to adapt the input to improve the output? There could be other reasons why we don't want to do that. We don't necessarily want to change all our writing to serve the machine, but if we are interested in applying machine translation in certain use cases, what kind of adaptations might we make to the input? Because one of the best ways to improve the output of machine translation is to improve the input. It's some, counterintuitive, I think, for people who are not language professionals. So there's a lot to be explored there. The whole question of creativity, even 10 years ago, nobody would mention machine translation and literary translation in the same sentence, right? Like this, even 10 years ago, this was just not something that we would ever put together. And now, of course, we've seen many examples of people exploring and looking for ways of combining more creative types of texts with machine translation, but I think there's still a lot to do there. So looking at what are the impacts of generated language on creativity, how is it affecting the creative aspect of language? Is it imposing a sort of homogeneity? Will there be a point where language just becomes very flat? We don't know at which point. This is a kind of would benefit from a longitudinal study, and we haven't had long enough yet, but we need to start them now so that we can track how it's performing in the future. And I would say the same for just any type of long-term effect on language we haven't had long enough, but it would be interesting to start the process now, and especially to see how these tools are affecting languages that might fall into different categories, like the low resource and the high resource languages that we talked about the other day. Is it having different effects on different language families, on languages with different number of resources available? And, you know, what are the long-term effects going to be? We have to start by gathering sort of baseline data. On the right-hand side more are a lot of these ethical issues that we kind of mentioned, but we don't know enough about. So again, a very rich area for exploration is the whole area of where different types of ethics intersect with data and with technology. So we talked a little bit about the challenge of data dispossession. Once you hand over your target text to your client, to your employer, you lose a little bit of control over what happens to that. And you know, how can we start maybe taking back some of that control? How can we advocate for having a little bit more of a say in how the data that we've produced is used for future purposes? We talked about that whole idea of framing data as a natural resource and how that can really undermine the skill that has gone into it, because it doesn't just appear there, right? We need to promote a little bit more, I think, the value add that we're bringing to the table and just how skilled of a profession translation is. And this is, of course, all of these questions are tied somehow to questions of economics or labor. What are the practices and policies that are starting to emerge, and how do we as a community want to influence them? And as I said, sort of take back a little bit of control, take back a little bit of respect for the work that we do. Privacy is linked to this as well in terms of is it okay for texts to simply be absorbed into these larger collections? What happens if there's sensitive information in there? Metadata can also be sensitive information. We don't think about that necessarily. That's the data behind the data. And how are we going to legislate or provide guidance for what can and cannot, what should and should not be in these data collections that are used for large language models and neural machine translation. I didn't talk too much about bias in the data, but we did talk about it a little bit, so there is more work to be done here. Bias can be things like there have been quite a few studies now on gender and gendered language in corpora and how machine translation can sometimes perpetuate stereotypes. So Eva van Massenhof, who's a Belgian researcher, now working in the Netherlands, has done some really interesting work on gender, which uncovers the fact that if you're translating from a language that is not marked for gender, not marked for grammatical gender, so maybe I think Turkish is one example where there's a sort of gender neutral pronoun, but when you translate into a language like English or French or Spanish, you have to choose whether that pronoun becomes he or she. And there was sort of evidence that the machine translation system would choose what is most represented in the data for the words in the context around it. So if the pronoun was being attached to a word like is a doctor, it would choose a masculine pronoun, and if it was a nurse, it would choose a feminine pronoun, and that these kind of stereotypes which are present in the data are being perpetuated through machine translation. So, you know, again, it's not so much the algorithm, but the data. So it comes back to that question of how do we better curate our data to try and remove the possibility that it will produce biased language. So gender is one example, but of course you can imagine all kinds of other biases. Even things like language variety we mentioned. If your corpus is a mishmash of a whole bunch of language varieties, Are some better represented than others? I participated in a study where we actually investigated Microsoft Translator and found that it speaks Canadian French rather than French from France, which seems kind of counterintuitive until you realize that translation is such a prevalent activity in Canada that they somehow had access to more Canadian French data than they did translated bilingual parallel corpora for some other varieties. And so that is, for me, like a funny bias, but still, we're not understanding everything that's going on and how to curate our data better to prevent that. And then, of course, we know that there are just the potential for misuse of any technology, and machine translation is not immune to that. So, how might we're starting to see, kind of regulations around AI more generally, and do we need some, at least guidance around machine translation, recommendations for how it should be used in different settings. People are flying blind at the moment, so huge potential for contributions around policy work, recommendations, guidance, safeguarding, all of that kind of thing. And I don't need to talk more because we talked a lot about some of the environmental concerns around this technology as well. So tons of scope for research about, and these are just the newest technologies, right? The large language models and the neural machine translation. And who knows what's coming down the pipe, but we also still have quite prevalent use of CAT tools, like translation memories and terminology extraction tools. And so how can those existing tools be integrated with, or will they be superseded by, or are they better than some of these new tools? Was we often think that newer is better, but sometimes like some of the older technology might actually be a preferable choice in certain contexts. So we have to evaluate now the capacity of these new tools against some of the existing technologies. So hopefully that gives you ideas if you're looking for new research topics. Okay. And these are topics that kind of focus on the technologies doing translation. But as we know, there are many different subtasks in translation. And I think there's also a lot of scope for researching the way that AI can support other tasks that translators or translation researchers might need to do. So we need to think about, they call it prompt engineering, but it's basically like how to get good results from these tools. And so you might think of a prompt as being something like a translation brief. If you think about what you ideally want as information from your client or your employer before you set out to do a translation, kind of put ChatGPT or another chatbot in that position. What can you tell it to improve its output? So a little bit like a translation brief or a set of instructions for some task, how can you tweak your request in order to get better results, whatever your task is? Whether if it's translation, it would be like a translation brief, but if it's doing research, like how can you ask the question in a way that will get you the best results? And there's a lot of work to be done there in tweaking, because again, these tools don't think, they don't understand the way that we do. So we might need to query them in ways that are different than how we would query a person, and we need to experiment and figure that out. Some of these tools come with a setting that's called temperature. I don't necessarily like that as an analogy, but it's the one that they have chosen, so we're kind of stuck with it. But the idea is that you can adjust the temperature of the chatbot. And what it means is that you can either raise the temperature, which means that you will get the chatbot to give you more varied answers, or you can lower the temperature and then you are kind of constraining the creativity a little bit of the chatbot. So you can think about it as if you asked it the same question multiple times, if the temperature setting is high, it will answer the question in slightly different ways. And if you set the temperature very low, then you should get the same response every time you ask the same question. And so again, I think there's scope to sort of play with this, because one sort of favors accuracy and the other one favors a little bit, expression. And so again, how might we leverage this setting, or should we be leveraging this setting in the context of translation or writing or the kind of activities that we're engaged in? Of course, we have huge questions. Everyone has this question, including me. How do we bring these tools into translator education? They're quite new, so again, lots of scope to explore what is the best way to introduce them, when in the program should we introduce them, how do we assess the results of this? So many questions that are still waiting to be answered around AI and translator education. And then some of the other tasks that these tools are able to do, again, are they things that we would be interested in leveraging technology to help with some of these tasks? Are we interested in expanding our service offering with support from some of these tools? So how are these tools useful for transcription tasks? This could revolutionize people who have a lot of interviews to do, and how can we support them for transcribing data? How can they be integrated into interpreting support, for example? I mentioned as an example a few minutes ago that these tools can do things like paraphrasing, simplification of text, summarization of text, so all kinds of sort of intralingual translation. And how is that something that might be useful to us? We are researchers here in this room, so how can we leverage these tools to help us find sources for our research, to explain concepts, to help us understand the literature, part of that discovery phase. And again, what risks are there? How truthful are these answers that are being given by these tools? Do we need to, again, beware of them, or can we leverage them to our advantage? And then for content creation or transcreation, potentially, we mentioned the possibility of using tools for inspiration, so we don't need to kind of faithfully, copy down the answer that they give us, but they might inspire us to think in ways that we wouldn't have come up with on our own. So again, what is the potential there? Term extraction is another task, so anyone who signed up for the workshop tomorrow on AI and interpreting, one of the things we're going to look at in that workshop is the way that these tools perform term extraction compared to the existing more conventional approaches. So tons of scope for not only the task of translation, but other tasks that might be part of a translator's bigger profile or a researcher's bigger profile. Okay, any questions on that part? That was just sort of like some ideas of what we might be able to turn our attention to. Okay, I'll return more to the methods, which is what I had promised to talk about. And as I said, my emphasis here is going to be on trying to share with you the diversity of ways that we can investigate technology. So we had a really good grounding yesterday on different approaches, different strategies and techniques. I'm going to structure this part around sort of research orientations that were proposed by Saldana and O'Brien, one of the books that also Franz mentioned yesterday. And they identified kind of 4 potential research orientations. So orientations that are about the product. So we might think of that as sort of the text. What are these tools producing? The process, how are they affecting the way that we get the product? Who, the people using the tools? And finally, the context in which the texts are produced and maybe even received. And of course, it's possible to combine some of these different orientations into one larger project. So product-oriented research really, I guess, focuses on the outcome of a translation process or maybe a sub-process. It's usually what we think of as the target text, but it could be some other product that's involved. So terminologists, for example, their target text would be a term list. It's often, the research that we do about products is often comparative in nature. So we might have products that were produced either with or without the help of a tool, or that were produced by two different tools, and then we can kind of compare the results. And we often have a focus on assessing quality, right? That's a really important thing for a product, but it is also possible to focus on other factors, like how fast are we able to get that product, or how easy is it to post-edit something. So quality is important, but we might also consider a few other factors. So for each of these orientations, I've picked just a couple of examples from the literature that sort of show you how we might potentially investigate some things. So for the first example of a product-oriented approach is something called the TRACE project. And the sort of overarching goal of this project was to study whether translation memory systems could affect translations. So they had 90 participants, and each person translated 3 texts, and the 3 texts were translated under sort of different technological conditions. So the first one was done with a word processor only, the second one a word processor with a translation memory tool, and then the third one was what's called a tag editor, a sort of internal text processing environment which is integrated with the translation memory. And the results showed that there were differences depending on the tool environment. So their goal was to compare how a product was produced under different technological conditions. So that was a sort of comparative study. As another example, this one was a corpus-based variation study. So the research team produced a corpus which they divided into several subcorpora, and they had the same set of texts that had been translated, again, under different conditions. There was a human translation without the use of technology. There were translations produced in a CAT tool, so again, a translation memory environment, and then 3 different machine translated versions of a text. So the large corpus was kind of categorized by the tool or tool condition under which the texts were produced. And then they did some processing on the corpus. They tagged it for part of speech and lemmas, and were able to then analyze the corpus looking for lexicogrammatical patterns that pertain to the translation universals suggested by Lynne Bowker. And they compared the results across the different subcorpora. Which patterns show up when you have a machine translated version, this particular MT tool, which patterns show up when you've used a translation memory or when you've used no technology support to do the translation. So this was really looking at the product, the output in a corpus-based analysis context. And again, they found that yes, the translation conditions, the different technologies or the absence of technology can influence the types of patterns that are showing up in the text. So those were some examples of product-based studies. If we think about process-oriented research, here we're looking more to understand the behavior or the competence or maybe the expertise of the translators or the tool users, and as well as the sort of underlying cognitive processes behind these. So we're looking really at the relation between cognition and the translated product. And some of these examples were mentioned yesterday. We could think of introspection as one way of trying to get at what's happening in our minds. The think aloud protocols. We could have a cued retrospection, so thinking about it after the fact. As Franz pointed out, sometimes interpreters can't add a third requirement on speaking, listening, speaking, and telling you what they're doing. So after the fact, we could have keystroke logging, eye tracking. I know a number of these techniques are being used by you in your various projects. Recording, whether you're recording the screen, whether you're recording a video of the person or an audio recording. One of the challenges with process-oriented research is that it can be very time-consuming, right? We have a lot of tasks, so this is where we might need to think about whether some of these AI tools can facilitate some of those tasks, like transcription. And so we may have a smaller number of participants, which could limit the generalizability, but it also allows us a very deep dive into what is happening in the participants in our projects. So some examples of process-oriented research. We've seen quite a few people explore post-editing of machine-translated output and looking at trying to calculate the effort required to post-edit a text. Because this is an interesting question. Does it take more time, more effort to post-edit a text than to translate it from scratch? This could be an example of, why we may choose not to use technology. Right? That technology is not always progress for some tasks. So a number of people have investigated post-editing effort. This is one example. Here, the researchers start with the assumption that effort will be inversely related to productivity. So the more effort required, the lower the productivity, the less text or volume of text you'll be able to translate. So their approach was to measure temporal effort, how many words you could post-edit per minute, and also to measure cognitive effort. So they were using an eye tracker, where they interpreted a longer fixation to be the translator needing to reflect more, to think harder, to work out a solution. And they compared the processing speed and the average fixation time for each segment of the text to the scores that were assigned by automated MT metrics. So something like the Bleu score you might have heard of that tries to determine quality of machine translation. And the result of their study was that they found a correlation. The segments that had a higher score from the automated metric, like Bleu, so the segments that were determined to be better quality translations, required less time for post-editing. So they found a correlation there. Another example, this time from translation memory rather than machine translation. This researcher set out to explore whether or not it was beneficial, how much effort was required to edit a fuzzy match from a translation memory. So you know that a fuzzy match is a partial match, right? It's not an exact match, so it needs usually some type of editing in order to adapt it for the new target text. So in this case, the researcher set up an experiment with a control group and a test group. The control group did not use the translation memory, and the test group did use the translation memory. And the technique was to capture the keystrokes using a keylogger and to measure the pauses between keystrokes. Again, the assumption here put forward by the researchers was that a longer pause would indicate somehow that there was a greater mental processing going on. And the basic findings from this research were that editing a fuzzy match is indeed easier than translating from scratch. So these translators found that it helped them to have something to go on and adapt that rather than coming up with a completely original translation themselves. We can also explore technology from the perspective of the people, right? The people using it, whether they are language professionals, whether we might be comparing students against experienced translators. We can also look at how trainers feel about technology, how clients feel about it, other team members, project managers in localization, end users of the texts that have been produced by technology. So any person, basically, and their interaction with technology. Here we find very commonly used methods like questionnaires, like interviews, like focus groups, where we're really trying to get people's opinion, people's attitude, people's feelings or reactions to something about the use of technology for translation. We know that questionnaires can be good for reaching large groups. They can potentially be more generalizable, but we are not necessarily able to capture, depending on how the questionnaire is produced, if it's open or closed questions, we can't always capture the reasons, the explanations behind their feelings or behind their attitudes. So the questionnaire can give us a very broad look. Interviews and focus groups typically allow us to probe a little bit about the why. You know, why do you feel that way? But of course, it's potentially requiring a greater time investment on the part of both the participant and the researcher. So we often see smaller groups for focus groups or for interviews, smaller number of participants as compared to the questionnaires. But of course, these can be combined, and actually combining them can be quite powerful, right? We can get an overview from the questionnaire, and it can actually help to inform a little bit the types of questions that we would then ask in an interview or in a focus group. So an example of a sort of participant-oriented study, this was a survey of interpreters and computer tools. The goal was to ask the interpreters if they felt that they were being well served by computer-assisted interpreting tools. And it was done among professional interpreters, and the findings of the questionnaire were basically that the interpreters found less benefit from tools than translators. If we compared the results of the interpreter survey to the results of a translator survey, interpreters felt that they were being less well served or had less benefit from tools than translators reported. That some interpreters at this time, which is still just 8 years ago now, that there were many interpreters who were not aware of computer-aided interpreting because it did come a bit after computer-aided translation, and that they felt that the tools that were available to them for some of the tasks that they did before the interpreting itself, so maybe a terminological research, they felt that those needs were better met by tools than needs that were in the immediate act of interpreting. So again, it was just a way to sort of get the perceptions, impressions, attitudes about interpreters to the benefits or lack of benefits to technology. This is one that I like a lot as an example. I mentioned it, I think, in my very first lecture. There was a team of researchers, Kaisa Koskinen and Minna Ruokonen, who approached the kind of question of asking translators how they felt about technology through a design approach. This is an approach that's used often in marketing, trying to predict how people will react to a particular brand of product. And they adapted this method to investigate how translators felt about technology by asking them to basically write a love letter or a breakup letter to a tool of their choice. And it's a lovely study. It sounds like kind of like hokey, but it's very well done, and it is a very creative way, I think, of investigating attitudes towards technology. And some of their findings were a little bit surprising. So we often maybe instinctively feel that an older generation of translators is less likely to want to use technology or to feel good about technology. And in fact, their finding was that this isn't true, that the participants in the group who were a little bit older were very favorably disposed towards technology. They also found that in cases where people felt that they had had some ownership or, possibility to contribute to the design and development of a tool, they felt better about using those tools than tools that were just imposed on them or in which they had had no contribution. So this was a fun way of investigating technology. And the final orientation, this is context-oriented research. So this type of research is often ethnographic or sociological in nature, and it can take into account factors beyond the tool itself, but that might affect the use of that tool. So this could be like a policy, a company policy, or a deadline, how fast do you have to work. And one common way of conducting context-oriented research is the case study, which again was already discussed. Cases are real-life settings rather than controlled environments, so it's not an experimental lab setting, but more of an observational study, what's actually happening in this workplace setting. Important to remember that a case is not a sample, and this again was discussed yesterday. So we can't necessarily assume that we can generalize from a case, but of course we can conduct multiple case studies and compare them so we can get different perspectives on a situation. An example here could be a reception of machine translation study. So what are the sort of conditions that might affect somebody's willingness to accept machine translation or not? I did a study of this nature where I was interested in seeing how official language minority communities in Canada, so that means English speakers who live in Quebec, which is the French province, or French speakers who live outside of Quebec in an English-speaking region of Canada. So they are people who speak one of Canada's official languages, but not the official language that's common in the region where they live. So I was looking to see how they would receive information from the government if it had been machine translated. And in fact, I gave them 4 different options. They had human translations, they had machine translation that was completely unedited, raw machine translation, lightly edited to correct errors, but not to improve the style, and then a fully post-edited version, which tried to achieve a level that was comparable to a human translation. And initially, there were almost 100 Anglophones and almost 100 Francophones in the 2 groups. So again, the Anglophones living in Quebec and the Francophones living outside of Quebec. And the findings were, that these 2 communities receive machine translation very differently. They have quite different attitudes towards it. Many of the Anglophones actually needed the translation. They live in Quebec, but they are not fluent French speakers. And so they were happy with machine translation because it could help them understand the text. So they were looking at it from a very functional perspective. The Francophones, on the other hand, were looking at it from a much more ideological perspective. They could speak English, so they didn't need the translation, but they felt that they wanted it because they were Francophone and it was their right to have it. So they were less happy about getting a kind of functional, borderline quality machine translation and were much more likely to insist on human translation. I also gave them, I didn't put it on the slide, but also gave them information about the time and cost for producing the different versions. And again, the Francophones said, like, no, I don't care if it costs more. I don't care if it takes longer. It's important to us for our community to have high quality translation. And the Anglophones were more pragmatic. They're like, okay, well, if we accept the cheaper translation, then we could have more things translated for us. So their whole reasoning for wanting the translation was very different, and that impacted what level of quality they were willing to accept. I did continue the study as well, and a later follow-up study with Spanish-speaking people in Canada. So Spanish not an official language at all, so and got different results again from that community. So the distinction between it being an official language versus not an official language also impacted on their attitude and willingness to receive machine translated text. Another example, another Canadian example, sorry, I should have maybe chosen something more international. This was a study done in New Brunswick, which is Canada's only bilingual province. And the study was done in 3 different organizations in the public service, in the private sector, and in a sort of in-house private sector and a sort of agency, and looked at how these different types of translation organizations, or different organizations that need and use and include translators, how they governed the use of technology in their institutions. So this is an ethnographic approach where the researcher went and sat and observed how people were interacting with the technology, and also kind of then gathered information about company policies on tool use. And the findings showed that in some cases a tool was sort of imposed on the translators. In other cases, translators were welcome to use technology, but it was not so directed. They didn't have to use a particular tool. And one of the really interesting things that came out of this, it's not surprising, but it's helpful to have it documented, I think, is that sometimes translators' dissatisfaction is not with the technology itself, but with the conditions under which they are asked to use the technology. So translators were, we sometimes, I think, jump to, like, the translators are against technology, or this person is against this tool, but really what came out was the dissatisfaction was more around the business decisions governing tool use than about the tools themselves. So there were some requirements that, if it's an exact match in the translation memory, you must accept it. And in one of these cases, the tool had actually been, the settings had been adjusted so that translators had no choice but to accept it. They could not edit an exact match. It was disabled. And so, they felt really frustrated by that, but it wasn't the tool per se that was hampering them. It was the policy about how the tool had to be used. So again, just another kind of angle for investigating technology. And Franz had mentioned yesterday as well that we can combine methods, sometimes with a multi-method study, so using 2 different complementary approaches. Here's an example of an investigation into lexicographic web tools for second language writing. This was an investigation using students. They asked students to write an essay, and they collected data using screen capture and an eye tracker, and then they complemented that with a stimulated retrospective recall. So just taking a couple of different methods and combining them to get a sort of bigger picture. And then the mixed methods, where we really are trying to combine quantitative and qualitative approaches. This was an example of a study in translation memories again, and the idea was to, first of all, try to quantify whether the contents of a translation memory were inconsistent. Because we hear one of the promotional talk about translation memories is that they, one of their benefits is that they promote consistency. So the first part of this study was to look and see, are there inconsistencies in the translation memory database, and what types of inconsistencies, so categorizing them, counting them. And then the second part of the study was a qualitative part where translators were interviewed to determine whether or not they saw these inconsistencies as a problem. How did they, how did they handle them? Was it an issue? Were they okay with it? Did they just integrate the inconsistencies? How did they overcome that? So the quantitative and qualitative aspects over inconsistencies in a translation memory database. Okay, so that's just really just a whole bunch of examples that I hope will stimulate you to think about different ways of exploring technology, and that it's really limited only by your imagination. There's very diverse possibilities, ways to explore translation technologies. Any questions about that before I do a little bit of a deeper dive on one particular approach? No? Okay. So I totally take Reina's point from her introduction on Monday that we don't necessarily need another turn, but I think we are noticing that there are more and more studies of users of technology because the user group has expanded so much, right? The users of translation technology used to be language professionals, and now it's anyone who wants to. So we really have seen an explosion of users of translation technology, and therefore we need to do and are doing much more active research on tool users. If we think about sort of a traditional research model, in the past, our research used to be very much driven by the researchers themselves. It would be the researcher who came up with the research question, who chose the method, who collected the data, who analyzed it, who formed the conclusions, and who then shared the research, but often only with other researchers in the past. Okay? And under this model, researchers are really considered the experts. They are the people who know how research is done, who know how the outcomes will be used. They're kind of in the driver's seat. And this approach tends to work well for what we might describe as basic research, where we really just want to understand more about a phenomenon. But it somehow seems to be not always the right model for applied research. And when we are doing applied research, as much translation technology research is applied, we're often looking for a solution to a problem of some sort. This is getting more and more attention, I think, in general, not just for translation technology, but for all kinds of many disciplines. There's a lot of pressure now for universities to demonstrate their relevance to society. And so we are being asked to provide solutions to problems that exist in society. And there's this feeling that if the research is somehow funded from public money, that it should benefit citizens in some way. And you know, there's also the recognition that there are many problems in our world. So we you know, want to do our part to help find solutions for them. So when we're in this situation of doing applied research, then we need to think about who are the experts on society's problems. We might be the experts on problems in our own little area, like in translation, although often, you know, professional practicing translators have other insights that we as researchers don't have. But if we're looking now at a case where these users of translation technology could be from any walk of life, who are the experts on the problems that they're having or the challenges that they're experiencing? And what is our role? If we're not the expert, then what is our role in this type of situation? So, as I mentioned the other day, we kind of saw that early research on translation technology was really fundamental stuff. How do we build these tools? How can we explain to ourselves, our professional translation community, how the tools work? And now, you know, more describing the effects of tools on products, on processes, on people. But we are also looking at applied research. It's very commonly combined with technology. And as I mentioned, we already know quite a lot now about our own community of language professionals, right? Many translation technology researchers actually straddle the border. A lot of us have practical experience maybe before we came to research or alongside our research. So we know a lot about the language professional community, and so we are able to kind of maintain that role of expertise because we're straddling that border. But once we recognize that now the users are way beyond language professions, we know less about the issues that these people face, and we definitely are not necessarily the experts on the type of solutions they need. So who can answer those questions? If it's not the expert, then who can answer those questions? We're no longer in that role of unquestioned expertise. So what approach might be a useful one to take in a case where we want to conduct a sort of user study around translation technology? One thing I think to recognize is that translation technology researchers are not alone. We're not the only people to have decided like, oh, well, it would be worth investigating someone outside of our sphere, right? So we don't necessarily want to reinvent the wheel. There are methods out there, and one of the useful ones, I think, to kind of explore if you're interested in doing technology user research is what's often described as action research. It came out of psychology in the 1940s, and the sort of, I don't want to trivialize it, but the sort of catchphrase that has come up around it is this idea of you shouldn't study us as subjects, as was mentioned yesterday, that it's not about putting a microscope on a community and looking at them as subjects, but more about involving them as participants in the research process. So it's had quite a few different names. There are probably nuances of difference between these different names. So you might hear it described as action research or action science, cooperative inquiry, participatory research, community-based research, community-based participatory research. And say there are probably some nuances of difference between some of those, but what they all have in common is that they bring the community into the research process. So translation technology is not the first to encounter this. That's what I want to emphasize. So we can look to other fields and see what we can learn from them. So one of the fields where a lot of this type of research has been done is in the field of population health. So again, after the COVID pandemic, population health was very visible, and it certainly came to my attention that some of the methods applied there could be relevant to translation technology research. So this community-based participatory research has been used in the past to address health disparities. So again, some communities have been marginalized in terms of the level, quality of health care that they receive. And so researchers in population health came up with some core principles for community-based participatory research in their discipline. So they said this type of research should really address locally relevant problems. So the community determines the problems, and it should build on community strengths and resources. It's a much more collaborative way of doing research. So again, not studying the people like the guinea pigs over there, but actually engaging with them. And that one of the goals is that the community themselves should be able to take action based on the findings at the end of the day. So the researcher might go onto another project or back to their classroom, but the community should be left with, be equipped to kind of put the results into action for their own benefit. Okay? It's often an iterative process, so this can make it challenging if you're a master's student, for example. You don't have a lot of time, but at a doctoral level or postdoctoral level, when you might have a longer period of research, it's often an iterative process, so we don't always get it perfect the first time around, but we learn from the first time and then we try to do better the second time. We also have to remember that when it comes to disseminating the results, we don't just want to share them with ourselves, our own researcher community. This is much more about outreach, public benefit for the findings. And that, yeah, as I said, ideally there should be sort of sustainability, that the community can continue to benefit from the research even after the project ends. So what can we learn from this that we might apply in translation technology research? We need to identify a genuine issue. So it's not us coming up with an idea, but it's talking to the community and saying, what problems do you have? How can we perhaps work together to see if technology could be a viable solution for you? So it's engaging the community. And if you take the time to build that relationship, then you are likely to get more respondents to your survey, more people willing to be interviewed, right? Some of the challenges that we sometimes face with our research is we get a low response rate, or we don't get meaningful feedback because we don't have a relationship with the community. They don't trust us, they don't know us, and so these are things that we need to develop if we want to do meaningful user-based research. And by involving the community, we often do get better outcomes for our research. It might improve the quality. Maybe we're asking better questions. We're asking the right questions. It might lead to better uptake, right? So something comes of the research at the end of the day. It could help with policy development because now it's evidence-based policy development. And it could actually open the door for you to continue working with that community on new projects in the future. Things that communities don't like to see, so these are potential mistakes, some of which I have made, and I can now share my experience with you so that hopefully you will do better. One of the things that they don't like is when the research question is not really pertinent to them. We as a researcher come up with a question or a proposal, and we take it to the community and say, hey, I need you guys to participate in my project that I've designed. I want to know if machine translation can solve this problem. And the community will be like, well, why would we help you? That's not a problem that we're even interested in. It's not our problem. So why are we going to come in and help you? So rather than saying, how can I find a community for my project? It's like, what project can I develop with the community? What project would be beneficial to the community? The communities are very turned off when, as is becoming increasingly common, research funding agencies like you to have a community partner on your project. But the communities don't like it when you design the whole project and then you go and say, hey, I need a letter, and if it could be tomorrow, that would be great. And they're like, we have no buy-in to your project. We have not heard of this project. And they just feel kind of used by that. And I think it's just not malicious on the part of researchers, but it's so unlike the conventional way that we've been used to working. And then the funder just says, oh, and you need a letter of support. And it's sort of like, oh, it's the last thing on my tick list that I need to submit. And so you kind of ask for the letter after the fact rather than involving the community in the project design from the beginning. They also, I think, feel a bit ripped off when you don't share the results with them. If they come and give you their time and participate in your project, and then you just publish some academic article behind a paywall without kind of sharing the results with them in a meaningful format that they can make use of. They're not so happy about that, and they won't help you with your next project, and understandably. So basically what they don't like is this lack of respect, where they feel like a guinea pig or some kind of object. They don't like having no say in it. They don't like to feel that their time is being wasted. So they don't like to feel that you're doing research on the community. They want you to do research with the community. So I will say that my experience with this type of research is not always easy or comfortable, right? We are used to doing things in a certain way, and we're often used to kind of having to fight for our turf. Universities are terribly competitive environments, actually, and we're used to this kind of competitive situation. We're competing for funding. We're competing for a spot on this program. And we are less trained, I think, to work collaboratively. It is changing, but it's difficult sometimes for us to think we're not the expert. We're like, I just spent 12 years at grad school. Like, surely I can be the expert now. But we're not the experts in everything. So community-based research really requires you to take a different attitude. Also, building relationships and maintaining relationships is hugely time consuming. You have to see it as an investment. It's not easily compatible with this publish or perish frantic pace that we are finding ourselves in more and more. It's better aligned with slow academia. So I recognize that, again, this throws up privilege and marginalization quite clearly, that some people can afford to take that time. People like me now at this stage of my career, I can afford to take that time. I didn't feel like I had that time when I was on the tenure track, for example, or when I was in grad school. So again, just thinking, you know, maybe there are different points in our career where community-based research is easier or more pragmatic. And it might not be at the stage you're at now, but you know, think about when and where this might be an approach that you can integrate into your research. Funders want community partners, certainly in Canada anyway. This is becoming regular. We're seeing, like, you know, if you have a community partner, this is better. That's the funders want to fund socially relevant research, and that means having a partner from society. But at the same time, they still have this hierarchical notion. So we still often see that we need a letter of support from the community partner, but the community group cannot apply for the funding. The funding still has to be applied for by the academic rather than by the community partner, and that sets up a power relationship. And the academic is, you know, managing the funding, deciding who gets to spend and whatnot. So there's the talk on the one hand, and then there's the kind of actual systematic or systemic way that funding is managed. So you have to, so that puts you in a very difficult position as an academic who's the project leader, but also trying to be a community-based approach. And I will say that the traditional rewards or incentives in academia don't align with community-based research. We are typically rewarded for the journal article and not for the blog post. We are, you know, kind of judged on our CV for academic output and not for these other types of dissemination, which the community appreciates. And they do take time, right? So time that you're spending on knowledge dissemination and outreach is time that you're not spending on academic publications, but the academic publications are more validated. So again, I feel like maybe this is challenging at an early stage in your career, possibly more feasible at a later stage in your career, but certainly something that you should be aware of. But I also think it's something that we need to work to change. Just like I said, we are our professional associations. As translators, we are professional associations. As academics, we are the people who decide on how we credit the time of our peers. If we're sitting on these committees to evaluate someone's tenure application, to evaluate someone's promotion application, to evaluate someone's job application, we can speak up and say, hey, I really like the fact that this person has done a lot of community outreach. Look, they have written, you know, a blog post, they've been on a podcast, they've written an opinion piece for a newspaper. That's valuable. We should value that alongside an article or a book chapter or whatever. But we have to speak up and say that rather than simply saying, oh, no, you know, just discount that. That's irrelevant, and we're only looking at the number of journal articles. So I think we need to change our own mindset a little bit. So this type of research is not easy, but then I also think maybe research isn't supposed to be easy, and that we need to be prepared to invest. But if you want to do user research, in my experience, this is a more successful way of doing user research, but it does require a slightly different approach and a different level of investment. So, wrapping up, I would say that if you have tools, you have users, right? If there are tools, there are users. And users are from communities, and communities are different. So there's no one-size-fits-all solution here. you really do need to communicate with the community that you want to work with and not necessarily make assumptions based on some other community that you might be part of or that you've heard of. You really need to take time to get to know your community. The user base of translation tools has exploded. It's now, yes, it includes language professionals, but it includes other professionals, people using machine translation for professional purposes in a profession other than translation, but also lay people. Also, we have to think about not just the users of the tools themselves, but the users of the products produced by those tools. So the people who are making decisions based on a text that has been translated by a machine or a human-machine combination. We really don't know much about them. And we are no longer the experts on how tools are used outside of our community. So we don't know what these users need. We have to ask them. We have to be part of a collaborative process. And this research can bring change, action, whether it's policy development, whether it's better tools, whether it's improved working conditions for people, whether it's just more informed, critical approach to using tools. We can actually affect change if we work with communities. Other disciplines do community research. I've brought an example from population health, but again, that's not the only example. If you are interested in user-based or community-based research, look and see what has happened in other disciplines. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can adapt and bring some of those techniques over to translation technology research. A lot of what I said, I feel like it sounds like common sense, but we're still not doing it well, I think, because it's hard. It's very different than the type of research that we've often been trained in. But if you do want to do research on users of translation technology, then I would advise you to, if you can, involve the community early and often. Don't assume what they need, but ask them what they need. And then take their input and use that at all phases of the research. When you're defining your research question, when you're choosing your method, address an actual need rather than a manufactured need that you've come up with. You will have to invest in the relationship if you want to gain trust, but that will pay off for you because you will get better engagement with your work. People will answer your survey. People will show up for your interview. People will want to work with you on the next project. Don't forget to close the loop, by which I mean make the results of the project available to the community that helped you and make it available to them in a form that's meaningful to them. So it might not be an academic article. And think sustainability. Think about building a relationship for the long term and providing that community, equipping that community with results that can help them in the long term. And then I said, we are academia, so if we want this type of research to be counted, I guess, by our peers, by our superiors, then we need to be advocates for community-based research and recognize that it will have different, require different type of investment, and it might also lead to different type of results, but just because they're different doesn't mean they're not equal or valuable or worthy. Okay. Daniel?
Yes, Lynn, thank you very much. I particularly appreciated the very last part of your presentation, and I thought that in case you didn't mention it, sign language interpreting is one place where we have an outstanding cooperation with the community. So if people are interested, look for papers by Jemina Napier, Oliver Stone, and many others. Just look at the bibliography, see many examples, and it's quite clear to see why the community of deaf people, signing deaf people, are interested in research done by sign language interpreters.
And those people have put in the time and effort to build that relationship with the community, and that's why it works. Yeah, thank you for bringing that. I didn't single it out, but it's an excellent example. They're leaders in this type of work. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I had a question actually about the first part of your presentation,
Sure.
where you gave some options on
The
to-
iceberg? The iceberg thing?
no.
No?
No, maybe it's the second part.
Okay, yeah.
No, it was actually about like the tools that you suggested that could be interesting to use in our research projects, like to transcribe data or to, exactly this slide. But I also thought about using some stuff to transcribe my data, for example, or AI-based tools. But there's always like a small kind of doubt that I have about the ethical concerns behind these tools, and also like the vulnerability of the data that I would put in these tools. Doctor-patient encounters are very sensitive data, and I have a lot of data, so it could help. But there is still like this small. So I was wondering how you look at this issue.
Yeah, so part of what we could take away from this slide is that we need to do research about exactly this, about people's concerns, about people's experiences for people who have tried it and who have not. So this is not so much me saying, you know, use these tools for transcription or whatever, but saying we don't know about whether they should be used, how they should be used, what concerns people have. So these are actually research topics in a way at this point, because they are still so new and we don't have a lot of data. I share some of your concerns. I think I would hesitate myself to put any kind of sensitive data into them. But are other people doing it? So that's what I mean. So these could be topics of research. So we can research not only how tools are used for translation, but how translation researchers use or don't use or have concerns about other kinds of tools. Yeah, unfortunately, I can't actually answer the question. I definitely share your concerns, though, and I think you're smart at this point to be cautious. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think our time is just about run out, so thank you for a very impassioned plea also for community-based research methods, which I think is a really interesting future direction or current direction that we should all be aware of and consider participating in.